Rome, 1992. The Colosseum rose in golden light, its arches echoing with the chatter of tourists and the shuffle of countless footsteps. It was a place where centuries of history lived, side by side with the rhythm of modern life. But only a few streets away, in shadows far removed from the postcard image, a young woman disappeared without a trace. No screams were heard, no alarm was raised, just silence that stretched into dread. Her absence became a wound that the city carried quietly, long after the police files grew cold and the headlines faded. For decades, the case lingered like a ghost at the edge of Rome's grandeur, unanswered questions haunting every anniversary. Then, almost 30 years later, science and persistence uncovered the truth and the name behind the crime. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, rewriting everything they thought they knew. The Colosseum has always stood as Rome's most enduring landmark, a monument to power, beauty, and blood. For nearly 2,000 years, its weathered stones have absorbed the cries of gladiators, the cheers of emperors, and the murmurs of travelers from every corner of the world. By 1992, it was less an arena of combat than a living postcard, a place where school children posed for photographs, where vendors sold trinkets, where life felt safe under the watchful gaze of history. Yet just beyond its glow, the labyrinthine streets of the Eternal City carried shadows of their own. That year, amid the swirl of tourists and locals, a young woman walked into those shadows and never returned. Her case, like so many others, became entangled in bureaucracy, lost in the shuffle of a justice system already strained by corruption and scandal. To officials, she was another file number. To her family, she was a daughter, a sister, a heartbeat suddenly missing. For decades, Rome carried her absence in silence. Beneath the city's grandeur, unanswered questions gnawed at those who remembered her. Who had taken her? Why here, in the shadow of one of the world's most iconic monuments? The answers seemed destined to remain buried. And then, nearly 30 years later, the silence broke. A DNA match, a suspect unmasked, a community shaken to its core. The Colosseum, which had watched centuries of human triumph and cruelty, bore silent witness once again, this time to a modern story of betrayal, resilience, and justice long delayed. She was 23, brimming with the kind of energy that made people believe her life was only beginning. Friends described her as radiant, the sort of person who could make an ordinary day feel extraordinary with a quick smile or a kind word. Her name became synonymous with warmth in the close-knit circle that loved her. A daughter cherished by her parents, a sister admired by her younger brother, and a friend whose absence left a silence louder than words. She had come to Rome in the spring of 1992, driven by ambition and curiosity. A recent university graduate, she wanted to immerse herself in art history, to study the works she had only seen in textbooks, and to experience the heartbeat of a city where past and present intertwined. She took a modest apartment within walking distance of the Colosseum, its ancient arches visible from her street, a daily reminder of the history she admired. Her days were filled with lectures, afternoons in dusty libraries, and evenings spent sketching ruins in her journal. Beyond her studies, she was known for her compassion. Neighbors remembered her habit of greeting the elderly shopkeepers along her route, always stopping to help carry bags or exchange pleasantries. Her letters home reflected a young woman in love with the city's rhythm, the clatter of espresso cups, the violinists near piazzas, the golden sun, sets falling over domes. She spoke of feeling alive in Rome, even as she confessed a wariness about its darker corners, where shadows stretched long and strangers lingered too close. Those closest to her recall that she was careful but not fearful, independent yet trusting. She believed the world was largely good, that people's intentions were kind. It was this openness that made her beloved, and perhaps also what made her vulnerable. In the city's maze of narrow alleys and cobblestone streets, opportunity and danger often lived side by side. Her life was not extraordinary by the measure of headlines, but it was extraordinary to the people who knew her. She was building a future defined by curiosity, kindness, and quiet determination. That future was stolen in a moment no one saw coming. On the evening of May 17, 1992, the city of Rome pulsed with its usual vitality. The streets surrounding the Colosseum bustled with tourists snapping photographs and couples strolling arm in arm beneath the soft glow of street lamps. Cafes spilled their laughter and clinking glasses out into the warm night air, a soundtrack to an ordinary Roman Saturday. For her, it began as a night of routine, one that seemed so harmless at first, so ordinary it could have been easily forgotten. But every ordinary detail of that evening would later become sacred, replayed endlessly in the minds of those left behind. She met two friends at a cafe just a few blocks from the Colosseum, a place where students gathered after long days of study. They lingered over cappuccinos, sketchbooks open, conversations drifting between plans for the summer and the promise of upcoming art exhibits. Witnesses later recalled her animated laugh, her hands moving with energy as she told stories. She was vibrant, present, alive, the kind of small, unremarkable evening memory that would later be burned into testimony. Around 9:15 p.m., the group dispersed. One friend walked toward the bus stop, another hailed a taxi. She decided to walk the short distance home, a choice that would have seemed safe. In the familiar streets she had traversed countless times before, CCTV from a shop's security camera briefly caught her image. Head tilted slightly as if listening to music, her bag slung over one shoulder, her steps unhurried. That grainy footage would later become one of the last known sights of her alive. Somewhere between the cafe and her apartment, her phone rang. A neighbor later testified that she saw the young woman stop briefly to check it, hesitating before tucking it away unanswered. The call, traced later, came from her mother, a moment of near connection that, in hindsight, became unbearably poignant. At 9:30, a couple walking their dog noticed her passing under an archway, her outline illuminated in the lamplight. They remembered her polite nod and the faint sound of her shoes on the stones. It was the last time anyone reported seeing her. Minutes later, her path would take her into narrower alleys, where the hum of the city dimmed and shadows thickened. From there, the trail dissolved. No one saw her enter her apartment. No neighbor heard a struggle. It was as if the night had simply swallowed her whole. The stillness of the Colosseum stood only a few streets away, indifferent and eternal, while a single life vanished into silence. In the days and years to come, investigators would pore over these fragments, the laughter in the cafe, the blurred image on a CCTV tape, the unanswered call, the couple's fleeting nod. Each moment felt agonizingly ordinary. And yet, strung together, they carried the weight of impending tragedy. What had seemed like a casual, safe walk through the heart of Rome became the scene of an unsolved mystery, a disappearance that left no sound, no struggle, no immediate alarm, just a young woman stepping into the night, and then nothing. The following morning, sunlight poured across Rome as if nothing had changed. Tourists lined up at the Colosseum gates, cameras ready, while cafes bustled with early risers. Yet only a few miles away, a family awoke to silence. Her mother's call from the previous night had gone unanswered, unusual, but not alarming on its own. By morning, however, the absence of a reply felt unsettling. She always called back. Always. By midday, worry curdled into dread. Her friends tried reaching her apartment phone. There was no answer. One walked by her building and rang the buzzer repeatedly, but the door remained closed, curtains drawn. By evening, she had missed a scheduled meeting with a study group, something she would never casually neglect. The first whispers of panic spread. Perhaps she was sick, perhaps she had fallen, but beneath the excuses her loved ones sensed a darker truth pressing in. Her parents, hundreds of kilometers away, contacted local relatives, urging them to check on her. A cousin arrived at her apartment late that night, knocking until his fists ached. The door did not open. Fear had now replaced confusion. Calls were made to the police, reports were filed, but the response was weary, dismissive. Young adults went missing in Rome all the time, they said. Most returned within days. Meanwhile, just beyond the family's anguish, life in the Colosseum district carried on untouched. Street performers strummed guitars, vendors hawked souvenirs, and couples posed beneath ancient arches. The city pulsed with indifference, unaware that in its midst, a family's world was collapsing. By the second night, the truth could no longer be denied. Something was terribly wrong. The silence surrounding her absence was not the silence of independence or distraction. It was the silence of disappearance, the kind that chills the bones and lingers like a storm on the horizon. Chad. When the missing person report was officially logged, the Roman police treated it with the kind of routine detachment that families of the vanished would come to know too well. In the early 1990s, Italy's capital was already weighed down by layers of bureaucracy and a flood of cases competing for attention. Organized crime, political corruption, and petty street offenses consumed much of the force's energy. A single young woman's disappearance, tragic as it was, barely pierced the noise. The first searches began, though haltingly. Officers retraced her steps from the cafe, canvassing the cobblestone alleys and interviewing staff who remembered her that evening. Some witnesses recalled seeing her leave around 9:15 p.m., laughing with friends. Others were hazier, offering vague recollections that blurred under the haze of late-night crowds. CCTV coverage in the district was limited, grainy, and easily misplaced in the shuffle of tapes. One recording from a convenience store, showing her walking past alone, was shelved without careful logging. By the time it was revisited, crucial seconds of footage had been taped over by newer recordings. The family pressed for urgency. They showed up daily at the precinct, asking about leads, demanding answers. Yet each conversation ended in a familiar refrain: "Give it time, these things usually resolve." The words felt hollow, especially when paired with shrugged shoulders and overworked detectives juggling multiple assignments. Jurisdictional conflicts added to the confusion. Because she was a foreign student, questions arose about whether her embassy should be involved. Paperwork slowed, requests for collaboration between departments tangled in red tape. Weeks stretched into months with little progress. Rumors of possible suspects surfaced. Police briefly questioned an ex-boyfriend, only to dismiss him quickly. They detained a local vendor accused of harassing women near the Colosseum, but evidence was thin, and he was released. Each lead flared brightly for a moment before burning out, leaving the family and the public more desperate than before. Behind closed doors, frustration mounted. Detectives quietly admitted the case had no solid direction. Without witnesses, without physical evidence, and without political will, the investigation sagged under its own weight. Files were shuffled into drawers, waiting for new life that never seemed to come. For her family, every delay felt like betrayal. They plastered posters along the streets, begging strangers for information. They handed out flyers near the Colosseum, where tourists accepted them politely, often without understanding the language. And still, the official search felt lifeless, burdened more by bureaucracy than by urgency. The most painful truth emerged slowly. The very institutions meant to protect them seemed incapable, or unwilling, to act with the speed her disappearance required. The case that should have been a priority became just another folder in a stack of unresolved mysteries. The cracks in the system were widening, and a young woman's life had slipped through them. In the absence of progress, silence was quickly filled with noise. Rome in the early 90s was a city where gossip traveled faster than fact, and when the official investigation faltered, speculation rushed in like water through a cracked wall. Some claimed it was the work of petty thieves, a robbery gone wrong in the dimly lit alleys near the Colosseum. Tourists were frequent targets, and the idea that she might have resisted a mugging seemed, to many, plausible. Others whispered of something darker. A jealous ex-boyfriend had been briefly questioned, and though police dismissed him, the seed of suspicion had already been planted. Neighbors spoke in low tones about arguments they imagined she might have had, lovers they believed she must have hidden. Then came the mafia theories. In a decade when organized crime held a vice-like grip on many Italian cities, it was easy for tabloids to suggest that her disappearance wasn't random at all. Articles hinted at trafficking, at debts unpaid, at a young woman caught in a net far larger than her own life. Sensational headlines sold copies, even if they eroded the dignity of the victim. Her reputation became collateral damage. Rumors claimed she was living a double life, student by day, something else entirely by night. Others insisted she had staged her own disappearance, fleeing responsibilities, or hiding from a secret. None of these stories were grounded in evidence, but repetition gave them weight. Each false narrative chipped away at her memory, transforming a flesh-and-blood young woman into a character in a lurid urban myth. The family bore the worst of it. Friends back home read rumors in foreign press clippings, unsure what to believe. Strangers eyed them with a mix of pity and suspicion. The more the case was discussed in cafes and newsstands, the further the truth seemed to drift. For the community, division grew. Some believed she had been a victim of circumstance, another casualty of Rome's chaotic streets. Others insisted there was something she wasn't telling, something hidden in her past that explained everything. What began as grief turned into a theater of accusation and defense, as though her life was no longer her own, but public property. In this fog of rumor, the real story, the truth of what had happened on that night near the Colosseum, slipped further from reach. The case was no longer about justice. It was about narratives, each one more unsettling than the last. Rome had always been a city of spectacle, but in the weeks after her disappearance, the Colosseum took on a darker kind of stagecraft. Posters bearing her smiling face were taped to lampposts and bus stops, fluttering in the summer wind. Candlelight vigils gathered near the amphitheater's stone arches, tourists and locals alike pausing to bow their heads, whisper prayers, or leave flowers on the cobblestones. For a while, the city seemed to pulse with a collective determination. Find her, bring her home. But solidarity soon gave way to fractures. Some neighbors and activists rallied around the family, helping distribute flyers, organizing marches, and demanding police accountability. Others grew uneasy. "They're making too much noise," a shopkeeper muttered, drawing shame onto the neighborhood. Whispers suggested the family was exaggerating, that by going public they had stained Rome's image at a time when tourism was the city's lifeblood. The Colosseum, usually a place where laughter and camera shutters filled the air, became uncanny. Guides would gesture toward its arches with practiced lines about gladiators, but their voices faltered when they noticed the posters on nearby walls. Visitors reported feeling a chill, as though the stones themselves were holding a secret. It was as if the ancient arena had once again absorbed blood into its soil, not from combat, but from a modern disappearance. Public trauma morphed into paranoia. Women began avoiding certain side streets at night. Parents warned daughters not to linger in cafes after dark. Taxi drivers told stories of strange men prowling the piazzas. Every shadow in the Colosseum district seemed heavier, every empty corner suspicious. For the family, the community's divided reaction cut deep. They drew strength from those who stood with them, but each sideways glance, each muttered accusation stung like betrayal. Their grief became performance, forced into the spotlight of a city that couldn't decide whether to embrace or reject them. By the end of that year, the Colosseum had become more than a landmark. It was a monument to absence. Crowds still gathered beneath its arches, but now, woven into the city's fabric, was a ghost story everyone knew but few wanted to confront. Rome, eternal and indifferent, carried on, but a shadow stretched across its heart, refusing to fade. The early months of the investigation were littered with hope that always seemed to curdle into despair. Detectives fielded calls daily. A shopkeeper claimed to have seen her boarding a bus to Florence. A hotel clerk swore she had checked in under a false name. A tourist couple insisted they spotted her near the Trevi Fountain days after she vanished. Each lead carried a flicker of possibility, the chance that she was still alive, somewhere. But every pursuit ended the same way. The bus passenger was a foreign student with a similar haircut. The hotel clerk had misread the register. The tourist couple, under closer questioning, admitted they weren't entirely sure. Files piled up with reports stamped inconclusive, and the momentum of the case slowed to a crawl. Anonymous tips poured in, some cruel, others delusional. A caller whispered that she had been taken by a secret sect. Another claimed to have buried her body outside the city. Police spent days digging in fields, dredging canals, scouring abandoned warehouses. Nothing. With each fruitless search, resources thinned and skepticism deepened. Detectives grew wary of chasing ghosts, but the family begged them not to. Give up, clinging to every shred of possibility. Witnesses, too, proved unreliable. Some contradicted each other outright, others seemed eager for attention. The fog of misinformation became as thick as the summer heat that had first enveloped the Colosseum the night she disappeared. In that haze, truth was impossible to pin down. By the end of the first year, the case was suffocating under the weight of false leads. Each disappointment eroded trust. The family's trust in the police's trust in the public, and the public's trust in any eventual resolution. What had begun as a desperate manhunt began to look like a slow, inevitable surrender. The silence that followed was not just absence, but exhaustion, the hollow sound of hope collapsing. As months turned into years, the case that had once dominated Rome's headlines slid quietly into obscurity. Newspapers no longer printed her face on the front page, and television anchors stopped mentioning her name. What had once been an urgent mystery transformed into just another file in the archives of the city's police department. The folder that bore her name was transferred from desk to desk until finally it found a home in a storage cabinet deep in the precinct basement. There, dust gathered on its edges, the paper within fading yellow under the weight of neglect. Each form, each interview transcript, each photograph was frozen in time, a snapshot of an investigation that had run out of breath. Outside, Rome carried on. The Colosseum drew millions of visitors each year, its arches now lit at night with the glow of modern floodlights. New cafes opened, cars became sleeker, technology crept into every corner of life. The city thrived, pulsating with a future that seemed brighter, faster, more connected. But for one family, time did not move at all. Their grief remained rooted in 1992, as if the world had spun forward and left them behind in an unchanging nightmare. Her mother kept her room untouched. Books lay stacked where she had last placed them, a hairbrush with strands of her hair rested on the dresser, and a small suitcase, once packed for a weekend trip, sat at the edge of the bed. The father spent his evenings rereading old police statements, searching for overlooked clues, as though repetition might somehow loosen truth from silence. Holidays became rituals of absence, an empty chair at the dinner table, a photograph propped among the candles. The silence became unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was full of unanswered questions, unspoken fears, and unrelenting memories. For the family, every phone call that rang late at night carried the cruel hope of news, and every knock at the door stirred a desperate imagining. Yet time after time, it was nothing. Even the community's memory faded. The vigils stopped, the posters peeled away, and people who once spoke her name with urgency now offered only sympathetic nods when the family raised the subject. "It's been so long," they would say, as if the passage of years lessened the weight of loss. But the family refused surrender. They wrote letters to police commissioners, pleaded with journalists, and chased down rumors whispered in train stations and markets. Each effort ended in disappointment, yet they could not let go. To stop searching would be to admit she was gone, and that was a truth too heavy to bear. So the city lived on, modern, beautiful, indifferent, while the family lived in pause. The Colosseum, eternal stone against the rush of centuries, seemed almost to mirror their grief. Silent, immovable, and filled with echoes of lives once vibrant. In that silence, hope did not die. It hardened into something more fragile, a waiting, endless and excruciating, for a crack in the darkness. The turn of the new millennium brought with it changes no one could have predicted back in 1992. The world was shifting. Technology advanced at lightning speed, information flowed faster, and police work entered a new era where science, not just intuition, began to carry cases forward. Yet for the family, these global shifts seemed distant, irrelevant. Their daughter's case was still trapped in a dusty cabinet, suspended in time. That changed when Rome's newly formed cold case unit began re-evaluating unsolved files. Among the thousands of names was hers. To most, it was just another folder. To one particular investigator, it was a challenge he couldn't ignore. A detective in his early 40s, seasoned yet restless, he had joined the unit precisely because he couldn't bear to think of lives abandoned in bureaucratic shadows. The faded photograph of the young woman smiling by the Colosseum struck him differently, not as an archive, but as a promise. By now, DNA testing had advanced leaps and bounds. What was once considered inconclusive in the 90s could now speak with near certainty. Evidence once dismissed as too degraded was being re-evaluated worldwide with remarkable results. In her case, a small collection of items had been preserved. Fragments of clothing, a hairbrush from her apartment, and a cigarette butt retrieved near the alley where she was last seen. At the time, these were curiosities. Now, they were keys. The detective arranged for the evidence to be retested. Weeks passed in silence, the kind of silence the family had learned to despise. But when the call came, it wasn't another dead end. There was DNA, partial, fragile, but enough to generate a profile. Enough to compare against national and internationals, databases that had been non-existent back when the case first stalled. For the family, the news was met with trembling disbelief. After decades of writing letters and begging for movement, someone was finally listening. The mother, now with gray hair and lines etched deep by grief, admitted she had stopped imagining this day would come. "I thought the world had forgotten her," she whispered to a journalist. And yet, here it was, the possibility, however slim, that answers might finally emerge. Still, skepticism lingered. They had been here before, teased by false starts and empty promises. Each resurgence of the case had ended with disappointment, leaving wounds deeper than before. This time, they tried to temper hope with caution. But the detective was different. He pressed forward, refusing to let bureaucratic hesitations stall him. He requested new interviews with old witnesses, re-examined the crime scene photographs, and even walked the same streets near the Colosseum, trying to see what investigators in 1992 might have overlooked. As word of the renewed investigation reached the community, reactions were mixed. Some shrugged it off, assuming it would end like every other attempt. Others felt the old unease resurface, remembering whispers of mafia connections, jealous lovers, and secrets buried in Rome's underbelly. A handful quietly feared that buried truths were about to claw their way into the light. For the family, anticipation became a delicate dance, daring to imagine closure, yet terrified of heartbreak. But for the first time in decades, the silence had been broken, and with it, the sense that their daughter's story had been lost forever. It wasn't closure yet, it wasn't justice, but it was something they had almost forgotten existed, a reason to hope. It began with something small, a fragment of fabric sealed in plastic, forgotten in a storage vault where it had sat untouched for years. To most, it was just another relic of a failed investigation. But to the cold case detective now steering the inquiry, it was potential. He ordered it sent to a forensic laboratory equipped with the newest DNA sequencing technology, far more sensitive than anything available in 1992. Technicians handled the evidence with reverence, aware that what lay before them wasn't just a piece of cloth, but the echo of a life cut short. Under the sterile lights of the lab, each step of the process carried weight. The careful opening of the seal, the swab of fibers, the quiet whir of machines extracting genetic material. At first, there was silence, the kind of silence that had defined the case for decades. Then, faint signals appeared on the screen, partial strands, incomplete but present. Forensic science had finally given her a voice. The detective was notified immediately. He arrived at the lab and stood shoulder to shoulder with the scientists, watching as fragments of DNA were carefully pieced together. The room felt suspended in time, every technician acutely aware that history was being rewritten in front of them. Each beep of the computer, each new data point, inched them closer to something unimaginable. A match. But science is patient, and patience meant waiting. The sample was fragile, degraded by time, and every attempt to amplify it risked losing it forever. Days turned into weeks of meticulous testing, cross-referencing, and validation. Finally, one evening, a profile emerged. Not perfect, but enough. It was uploaded into both Italian and international DNA databases. Then, the waiting resumed. The call came late, almost anticlimactic at first. A lab technician, voice trembling, informed the detective, "We have a hit." The WW. Ords hung in the air like a thunderclap. After decades of nothing, there was now a name. The match linked the DNA to a man with a criminal record, arrested years after the victim's disappearance on unrelated charges. At the time, his crimes had seemed minor compared to the brutality now implied, and he had slipped through the cracks. But the science was unflinching. The DNA on the fabric matched his profile. For the detective, the revelation was electrifying. He thought of the family, who had endured years of silence, and felt both relief and dread. Relief that answers had finally surfaced. Dread for the pain those answers would surely bring. Before notifying them, he double-checked everything, running the sample through multiple tests, consulting external labs, and ensuring that no procedural flaw could undo what they had uncovered. When the news reached the family, it arrived with the weight of a lifetime. The mother wept, not from joy, but from a complex, searing blend of grief, vindication, and fear of what would come next. The father, long stoic in his persistence, simply said, "At last." Their daughter's absence was no less painful, but now it carried shape. Not a mystery dissolving into rumor, but a truth demanding justice. The press caught wind almost immediately. Headlines exploded across Rome. Colosseum cold case breaks open after 30 years. Journalists speculated wildly, tracing the suspect's history, revisiting old theories, and portraying the breakthrough as both miraculous and inevitable in the age of modern forensics. The Colosseum, once a backdrop to silent sorrow, now became the stage of revelation. Within the police force, the discovery ignited urgency. Detectives who had once dismissed the case felt a sting of accountability. Younger officers, inspired by the triumph of science over silence, threw themselves into piecing together the suspect's movements in 1992. The breakthrough was not just a clue, it was a spark that reignited the entire investigation. For the family, the moment was surreal. After decades of unanswered prayers, justice was no longer a distant dream. It stood on their doorstep, fragile yet undeniable, carried by strands of DNA that had survived the erosion of time. The silence that had haunted them for so long was finally broken. And with that, the story shifted, no longer a question of what happened, but of who had done it, and what the truth would demand now that it could no longer be ignored. The DNA match left the authorities with no choice but to act. For decades, the case had been the symbol of failure, a reminder of lost evidence, bureaucratic stumbles, and unanswered questions. Now, with forensic science breathing new life into the investigation, police leadership knew they had to move swiftly and decisively. Anything less would be seen as negligence. The cold case file was pulled from the archives and placed squarely at the center of the Homicide Division's desk. Detectives who had once dismissed the case now found themselves under pressure to contribute. A task force was assembled, combining veterans with younger officers trained in modern investigative techniques. Their mandate was clear: unravel the truth, no matter how long it had been buried. Old suspects were called back in for questioning. Some were gray-haired now, their once confident alibis fraying under renewed scrutiny. One man who had claimed he was abroad at the time of the disappearance suddenly found investigators armed with travel records proving otherwise. Anant, her, once cleared for lack of evidence, now faced damning inconsistencies when asked to recall the night near the Colosseum. Each interview wasn't just about gathering information. It was about testing memory against fact, exposing cracks that had been invisible decades earlier. Meanwhile, the media descended with a fervor not seen since the early 1990s. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. The Colosseum cold case reopens after 30 years. Television anchors revisited grainy footage of the victim's family pleading for answers, juxtaposed with fresh images of police cars outside suspects' homes. Talk shows speculated endlessly. Was the killer someone in plain sight all along? Had the police failed the family by not connecting the dots sooner? For the family, the sudden surge of attention was both vindicating and overwhelming. They had spent years shouting into silence, their pleas ignored. Now their daughter's face was everywhere again, on posters, on screens, in headlines. Strangers approached them in the street to offer sympathy, while journalists camped outside their door, hoping for a statement. It felt like the city was finally listening, yet the noise was deafening. Within the investigation, urgency replaced complacency. Detectives retraced every step of the original inquiry, re-examining evidence, cross-checking witness statements, and digging into the suspect's criminal past. The once-forgotten mystery was no longer a relic of the past. It was alive again, burning with renewed intensity. The Colosseum itself seemed to loom larger in the narrative. Tourists still marveled at its arches and gladiatorial history, but locals began to see it differently. To them it was no longer just a monument of ancient bloodshed. It had become a symbol of modern tragedy, the silent witness to a crime whose answers were finally clawing their way to the Sioux face. The reopening of the case wasn't just an investigation, it was a reckoning, and Rome, captivated and unsettled, braced itself for the truth. The news broke on a gray morning that would be remembered for years. Police cars swarmed a quiet Roman neighborhood, blue lights flashing against the cobblestone streets. Neighbors leaned from their balconies, expecting perhaps a drug raid or a mafia sweep. But what they witnessed instead was unthinkable. A familiar face, a man they had trusted for decades, being led away in handcuffs. The suspect wasn't an outsider, nor the shadowy figure many had conjured in whispered theories. He was a respected member of the community, someone who had lived among them without suspicion. He had attended local church services, bought bread from the same corner bakery, and exchanged polite greetings on morning walks. Some even remembered him offering condolences to the victim's family back in 1992, his words heavy with feigned sorrow. The betrayal cut so deep because it came not from the dark alleys of Rome, but from the heart of its daylight. The identity sent shockwaves through the city. Headlines screamed, "Trusted neighbor arrested in Colosseum cold case." Television reporters scrambled to reconstruct his history, his jobs, his friendships, the facade of normalcy he had cultivated. To the public, he had been a steady figure, a man above suspicion. But behind that veneer lay a past more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. For the family, the revelation was devastating. They had shared streets and perhaps even conversations with the man who had stolen their daughter's future. The mother recalled moments when he had offered support, now twisted into a grotesque memory. The father, upon hearing the name, reportedly went pale and whispered, "All this time." Their grief, once abstract, was sharpened by the knife edge of betrayal. The community reacted with disbelief and fury. Friends who had once invited him into their homes now recoiled in horror, replaying decades of interactions with suspicion. Parents who had trusted him near their children shuddered at what might have been. Neighbors who had vouched for his character now questioned their own judgment. The betrayal wasn't only against the victim's family, it was against the entire community, a violation of trust so profound it left scars that would never fully fade. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering unsettling patterns in his past. Small infractions once brushed off as harmless quirks now seemed like early warnings. A dismissed police complaint from years earlier suddenly carried ominous weight. The narrative that emerged was chilling. A man who had mastered the art of blending in, hiding his darkness in plain sight. The arrest transformed the case from a haunting mystery into a searing indictment of trust and blindness. How could a man so visible remain invisible as a suspect? How had the system overlooked him for decades? The answers lay partly in the limitations of 1990s investigations, but the emotional truth was harder to bear. Sometimes evil wears the face of the familiar. As he was led into custody, cameras captured his expression, not remorse, not fear, but a cold detachment that unsettled even the most hardened detectives. Rome watched in silence as the man they thought they knew was unmasked as the predator who had stalked their streets and stolen a young woman's life. The reveal wasn't just shocking, it was a gut punch, the kind of truth that left an entire city gasping, wondering how well they really knew the people living next door. The courtroom was packed to the brim, every seat filled, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the aisles, their pens scratching notes, cameras poised to capture the spectacle. The trial was more than just the pursuit of justice for one young woman. It had become a reckoning for Rome itself, a battle to prove that even after decades, truth could prevail over time, lies, and silence. The prosecution began with quiet precision. They laid out the narrative step by step: the night of the disappearance, the last sightings, the overlooked evidence that had finally resurfaced in a dusty storage box. Photographs of the personal belonging, a handbag, preserved for 30 years, were projected on a screen. The room fell silent as the prosecutor explained how advances in forensic science had extracted a partial DNA profile from a bloodstain no one had thought usable in 1992. The testimony of the forensic experts was riveting. One described the painstaking process of analyzing the degraded sample. It was like piecing together a puzzle with missing edges. Every fragment mattered. Another scientist recounted the moment the match hit the database, his voice trembling as he said, "We knew, in that instant, the ghost of this case was about to step into the light." The family took the stand, their presence electrifying. The victim's mother, frail now but still carrying the weight of grief, spoke with a trembling voice. "For years we wondered if she was forgotten. This trial proves she wasn't." Her words brought tears to the jury, the gallery, even the stenographer who paused, blinking rapidly as she typed. The defense, however, was relentless. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the DNA could have been contaminated, that memories from 30 years ago could not be trusted. Their strategy hinged on sowing doubt. Witnesses were too old, records incomplete, forensic methods potentially flawed. They painted their client as a man of dignity, a pillar of the community, and framed the prosecution as scapegoating him to close an unsolvable case. Yet cracks appeared in their defense. Old acquaintances testified that his alibi from the night in question had always seemed shaky. One former friend admitted, "He asked me to lie for him back then. I didn't know why. Now I do." Another recalled an unsettling comment he had made about the victim, something brushed off at the time, but chilling in hindsight. The prosecution countered with brutal efficiency. They underscored the improbability of contamination, pointing out the chain of custody meticulously maintained since 1992. They highlighted inconsistencies in his story, contrasting them with the cold certainty of science. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the night of the murder until the jury could almost see it unfold before their eyes. At times, the tension was unbearable. Gasps rippled through the gallery when the prosecution replayed a recorded interview from decades earlier, where the accused, then much younger, gave a halting account of his whereabouts. Placed side by side with the forensic timeline, the lies were starkly illuminated. The defense scrambled in the face of mounting evidence, attempting to humanize their client. They brought in neighbors who vouched for his kindness, parishioners who swore to his devotion, even a priest who claimed he had been a man of service. But each testimony seemed hollow against the looming weight of science, grief, and the years of silence that now rang louder than words. The judge presided with a stern but weary demeanor, conscious of the trial's symbolic weight. This was not just about a single case. It was about Rome's confidence in its justice system. Could it still deliver truth after 30 years of failure? Day after day, the courtroom became a stage where law and memory clashed with denial and defense. The accused sat stone-faced, rarely reacting, though his occasional smirk sent shivers through the gallery. Was it arrogance or resignation? The jury watched him closely, weighing not only the evidence, but the man himself. By the time closing arguments arrived, the city seemed to hold its breath. The prosecution urged the jury not to let the decades blur justice. Time may have passed, but truth has not. This family deserves the closure denied to them for 30 years. The defense, in contrast, pleaded for mercy, warning against convicting a man on what they called ghost evidence. The trial ended not with resolution, but with a lingering, suffocating suspense. The jury withdrew to deliberate, and the world waited. Would justice, so long delayed, finally hold? Or would the cracks of time prove too wide to bridge? The verdict came on a gray morning, the kind of day where even Rome's golden light seemed muted, as if the city itself understood the gravity of the moment. After days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn, unreadable. The packed gallery leaned forward, breaths caught in collective suspense. When the foreperson stood and read the word guilty, the silence shattered. A muffled sob escaped from the victim's mother. Her hands trembled, clutching a rosary worn smooth by decades of prayer. The father closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the release of a burden carried far too long. For 30 years their lives had been suspended in uncertainty. Now, at last, there was an answer, not a joyous one, but a final one. The sentencing followed swiftly. The judge's voice was firm, but heavy with the awareness of history. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He acknowledged the failure of the system decade as earlier, but affirmed the present decision as an act of belated justice. Though time has passed, he said, truth cannot be buried forever. Justice delayed must not mean justice denied. His words echoed through the chamber, etched into memory. The accused sat impassive as the judgment fell. No tears, no pleas, no apology, just a blank stare that only deepened the community's sense of betrayal. For some, his silence was a final cruelty, a refusal to acknowledge the life he had stolen. For others, it was proof that the mask he wore for decades had never cracked until now. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Headlines the next day declared, "The Colosseum cold case closed." Crowds gathered near the ancient amphitheater, not to cheer, but to grieve. Flowers and candles began to appear along its walls, tributes not only to the young woman whose life was cut short, but to the endurance of her family's fight for truth. Tourists paused to take in the makeshift shrine, their photographs capturing not just Rome's grandeur, but its scars. For the family, closure did not mean healing. Relief came with a bitter edge. They had answers, but not their daughter. They had justice, but not peace. The mother, speaking quietly to reporters, put it simply, "We are grateful, but nothing will bring her back. We live with the silence she left behind." The community, too, carried the weight. Neighbors who once whispered rumors now spoke in hushed tones of remorse. The case had reminded them how quickly suspicion and sensationalism could cloud compassion. In a way, the conviction was not just about punishing one man, but about confronting the collective failure to protect one of their own. That evening, the Colosseum glowed under floodlights, as it always had, but those who passed by felt its presence differently, no longer just a monument to Rome's ancient struggles, but now also a silent witness to modern grief and resilience. Closure had come, yes, yet beneath the surface, wounds remained, permanent reminders that justice, even when served, cannot rewrite loss. History has a way of repeating itself, though never in the same form. Rome, with its layers of centuries pressed into stone, knows this truth well. The Colosseum, once the stage for gladiators and public executions, was built as both entertainment and warning. It embodied the human thirst for spectacle and the willingness to let violence become collective memory. Yet in 1992, just beyond its shadow, another kind of spectacle unfolded, not in the roar of the crowd, but in the silence of a disappearance. And decades later, the city was once again reminded that the quest for justice is never immune to delay, nor is it free of human failure. The Colosseum stands as a paradox, a monument to triumph and cruelty, endurance and ruin. So, too, does the story of this cold case. For 30 years, a family carried grief alone while the wider community looked away, distracted by life's distractions and dulled by the weight of time. Justice seemed forgotten, buried beneath bureaucracy and apathy. Yet technology, persistence, and a refusal to let silence win brought the truth back to light. This case proves that while time may erode stone, it can also sharpen the tools of science and sharpen the will of those who refuse to forget. DNA, once a fledgling science in the early 1990s, has become one of the greatest instruments of accountability. It cannot heal, but it can illuminate. Across the world, countless cold cases, dusty files left to gather cobwebs, are being reopened by laboratories where evidence long dismissed finds new meaning. Each breakthrough reminds us that the arc of justice may bend slowly, but it bends nonetheless. But there is another lesson here, one less comfortable. Justice delayed carries its own cruelty. For decades, the victim's family lived in a suspended state of mourning, denied closure, denied truth. They were forced to carry the burden that institute lions failed to shoulder. And while the eventual conviction brings relief, it does not erase those lost years. The system may congratulate itself on solving the case, but the cost was borne by those who had the least power to bear it. Communities, too, must face their complicity. The rumors, the whispered suspicions, the rush to assign blame, all became part of the wound. The family's grief was made heavier by speculation that often turned cruel. In this way, the case exposes not only a crime committed by one man, but a collective failing. The responsibility to support, not fracture, lies with all of us. Rome teaches this lesson best. Its stones tell stories of empires risen and fallen, of spectacles designed to distract from uncomfortable truths. But beneath those stories lies something more enduring: resilience. The family's refusal to let their daughter's name fade, the investigators who refused to let the case remain closed, the scientists who refused to stop refining their craft. All of them embody that resilience. This story, while uniquely Roman in its setting, speaks far beyond Italy's borders. It asks us to consider how many names are still gathering dust in forgotten files, how many families still wait for a phone call that may never come. It challenges us to invest not only in better forensic tools, but in more humane institutions, swifter responses, and communities that choose empathy over spectacle. As the Colosseum continues to stand, both ruin and wonder, it reminds us that humanity's darkest moments and brightest triumphs are often bound together. The cold case solved near its shadow is not just about one crime, one victim, or one arrest. It is about the enduring truth that while justice may sleep, it cannot be buried forever. The Colosseum has withstood centuries of storms, wars, and change. It is a monument to survival, but also a reminder of how human lives, once lost, cannot be rebuilt in stone. Tonight, its ancient arches hold a new story, not of gladiators or emperors, but of a young woman whose life was stolen in its shadow and whose silence echoed for 30 long years. Her case tells us that justice may stumble, it may stall, it may sleep, but with persistence, it can rise again. The verdict does not bring her back, but it ensures her name will never vanish into dust. The Colosseum remains, as it always has, a silent witness. But now it carries her memory too, a testimony carved not in marble, but in resilience, grief, and truth reclaimed. For her family, closure is bittersweet. For the community, the lessons linger. And for all of us, her story is a call to remember. No mystery should be left to rot in silence, no life reduced to rumor. Justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as we do not forget. Thank you for walking through this story with us. If you believe in uncovering hidden truths, in shining light on forgotten shadows, and in honoring the voices that time tried to erase, join us here. Subscribe, share, and stay with us for more investigations that matter. Because every story left untold is another silence waiting to be broken,